The morning of the 8th of September 2022 marked more than just the end of a remarkable life. When Queen Elizabeth II drew her final breath at Balmoral Castle, she took with her centuries of royal traditions that had shaped British society for generations. These customs, some dating back hundreds of years, had survived world wars, social revolutions, and technological advances, yet they could not survive the transition to a new monarch. Margaret Thompson had worked as a royal correspondent for 35 years when she received the call that would change everything. Standing outside Buckingham Palace that gray September morning, she watched as crowds gathered, their faces reflecting a mixture of grief and uncertainty. What many didn't realize was that they weren't just mourning a beloved queen, they were witnessing the end of an era defined by traditions that would never return. The first tradition to disappear was one that had governed royal communications for over 70 years. Throughout her reign, Queen Elizabeth II maintained a personal correspondence system that was entirely handwritten. Every thank you note, every response to children's letters, every formal communication bore her distinctive handwriting. Palace staff had grown accustomed to the sight of the Queen spending hours each evening at her desk, fountain pen in hand, personally crafting responses to thousands of letters received annually. Sarah Williams, who served as the Queen's private secretary from 1995 to 2010, remembered the meticulous care with which Her Majesty approached this task. The Queen insisted on reading every letter personally, often making notes in the margins about specific responses she wanted included. Children who wrote to her during school projects would receive personalized replies that addressed their particular questions or interests. Veterans who shared their service stories found their letters answered with detailed acknowledgments of their specific contributions. This tradition required an enormous investment of time. Palace records show that Queen Elizabeth II personally wrote over 3.5 million letters during her reign. The Queen's commitment to handwritten correspondence stemmed from her belief that personal touch mattered more than efficiency. She often told her staff that anyone who took the time to write to her deserved the courtesy of a personal response, not a typed letter from an assistant. The handwriting tradition extended beyond letters to official documents. Unlike her predecessors who gradually adopted typewriters and eventually computers for official business, Queen Elizabeth II continued to draft important speeches by hand well into the 21st century. Her Christmas broadcasts, speeches to Parliament, and addresses to the Commonwealth were first written in her careful script before being transcribed for official use. King Charles III, despite his deep respect for his mother's methods, recognized that maintaining this tradition would be impossible given the volume of modern communications and his own commitments as monarch. Within weeks of his accession, the palace announced that while the new king would personally sign important documents, routine correspondence would be handled through modern methods, including digital communications. The second tradition that ended was far more surprising to royal watchers and would indeed shock many who learned of its existence. For over 4 decades, Queen Elizabeth II maintained what palace insiders called the evening ritual, a highly personal tradition that connected her to ordinary British citizens in ways the public never knew. Every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, regardless of her location or schedule, Queen Elizabeth II would spend exactly 1 hour listening to voice messages left on a special telephone line established in 1981. This line, known only to palace staff as the People's Hour, allowed ordinary citizens to call and leave brief messages about their lives, concerns, celebrations, or simply to share their thoughts with their monarch. The idea originated during a particularly difficult period in British history, when unemployment was rising and social tensions were high. The Queen, concerned about feeling disconnected from her subjects' daily struggles, asked her private secretary to establish a way for people to communicate with her directly, without formality or protocol. The telephone line was set up with a simple recorded message. "You have reached a special line to share your thoughts. Please speak for no more than 2 minutes." Word of the line spread quietly through communities across Britain, passed along through neighborhood networks and local organizations. The Queen never publicized its existence, preferring that knowledge of it spread naturally among those who might benefit from having someone listen to their concerns. Callers ranged from elderly people living alone to young parents struggling with challenges, from students worried about their futures to workers facing redundancy. Elizabeth Harrison, who worked as the palace telephone operator responsible for managing these calls, recalled the Queen's dedication to this tradition. Every evening, Her Majesty would sit in her private study with a cup of tea, listening to dozens of messages through a special telephone system. She kept a leather-bound notebook where she made brief notes about particularly moving calls, sometimes asking staff to follow up with helpful information or resources for callers facing specific difficulties. The Queen never responded directly to these calls, maintaining the anonymity of both caller and listener. However, many who used the line reported feeling a sense of comfort simply from knowing their monarch was listening. Studies conducted by palace researchers showed that regular callers often experienced improved mental health and stronger connections to their community. This tradition represented something unique in modern monarchy, a direct, unfiltered connection between sovereign and subject that required no ceremony, no protocol, no intermediaries. The Queen valued these conversations as much as her formal audiences with world leaders, often saying they provided her with insights into the real concerns of her people that no official briefing could match. The telephone line received its final call on the 7th of September 2022, just hours before the Queen's death. The last message, from an elderly man in Wales, was a simple, "Thank you for listening all these years, Your Majesty. Rest well." Palace staff who knew about the tradition wept when they heard it, understanding that they were witnessing the end of something irreplaceable. King Charles III learned about the People's Hour only after his mother's death, when her private secretary presented him with the leather notebooks containing decades of observations about his future subjects' concerns. While moved by the tradition, he recognized that his different personality and communication style made continuing it impossible. The telephone line was quietly disconnected in November 2022. The third tradition that ended with Queen Elizabeth II was perhaps the most visible to those who knew where to look, yet it remained largely unknown to the general public. For 60 years, the Queen maintained a practice called the Morning Acknowledgements, a daily ritual that began each day at exactly 7:30 a.m. and involved personally reviewing and responding to what palace staff called the overnight concerns. These concerns weren't the formal diplomatic communications or official government business that filled the Queen's official schedule. Instead, they were reports compiled by a small team of palace staff who monitored news sources, social media, and community networks throughout the night, identifying situations where ordinary British citizens might benefit from royal acknowledgement or assistance. The tradition began in 1962, after the Queen read about a family in Manchester who had lost their home in a fire. She had wanted to express her sympathy and offer assistance, but by the time the palace's formal processes allowed for contact, the family had already moved away and could not be located. Frustrated by the delay, she established a system to identify such situations immediately and respond within hours rather than days or weeks. James Morrison, who coordinated the Morning Acknowledgements program from 1985 to 2020, explained how the system worked. A team of 12 staff members worked in rotating shifts, monitoring local news reports, hospital announcements, school newsletters, and community bulletin boards across the United Kingdom. They looked for stories of exceptional hardship, remarkable achievement by ordinary people, significant community service, or situations where royal recognition might provide comfort or encouragement. Each morning, they prepared a brief summary of potential acknowledgements, typically including 5 to 10 situations that met the Queen's criteria for personal attention. These might include families dealing with unexpected tragedy, individuals who had performed acts of heroism, communities rallying together during difficulties, or people achieving remarkable goals despite significant obstacles. The Queen would review these summaries over her morning tea, usually while her corgis ate their breakfast nearby. She made quick decisions about which situations warranted immediate attention, often writing brief instructions in the margins. Send flowers immediately. Arrange telephone call this afternoon. Invite for garden party. or request local assistance through Lord Lieutenant. What made this tradition remarkable was its speed and personal nature. Unlike formal royal communications that required extensive protocol and preparation, morning acknowledgements were designed to reach people quickly when royal attention would mean the most. A family dealing with a sudden death might receive flowers from the Queen within hours of the news becoming known. A child fighting serious illness might get a personal note and small gift delivered the same day their story appeared in local media. The Queen's responses were always proportionate and thoughtful. She never sought publicity for these gestures, often specifically requesting that recipients not share the communications with media. Her goal was genuine human connection and support, not public relations benefit. Many recipients only learned years later that their experience had been one of thousands of similar royal acknowledgements. Records kept by the Morning Acknowledgements team show that Queen Elizabeth II made over 180,000 such personal contacts during her reign, touching the lives of families and individuals across every community in Britain. The tradition required significant resources: palace staff to monitor situations, florists on standby for immediate delivery, a dedicated budget for gifts and assistance, and coordination with Lord Lieutenants across the country to provide follow-up support when needed. The personal nature of this tradition made it impossible to transfer to King Charles III, whose different schedule, priorities, and approach to monarchy required different systems for connecting with subjects. While he has established his own methods for recognizing and supporting citizens, the daily morning ritual that had shaped his mother's reign for 6 decades ended with her death. These 3 traditions, handwritten correspondence, the evening telephone ritual, and morning acknowledgements, represented Queen Elizabeth II's deeply personal approach to monarchy. They required enormous investments of time and energy that she gladly provided because she believed her role demanded genuine connection with her people, not just ceremonial appearances and state functions. Their disappearance marks more than just a change in royal protocol. It represents the end of a particular vision of monarchy based on personal service, individual attention, and direct human connection between sovereign and subject. While King Charles III has brought his own valuable approaches to royal service, the specific traditions that defined his mother's reign have become part of history, remembered now only by those who experienced them and the palace staff who helped maintain them for decades. The 4th tradition that disappeared with Queen Elizabeth II was one that connected the monarchy to British military families, in ways that remained largely invisible to the public eye. For 58 years, the Queen maintained what palace staff called the guardianship tradition, a personal commitment to the families of service members killed in action that extended far beyond official ceremonies and public recognitions. This tradition began in 1964 following the death of Sergeant Michael Davies, a young Welsh guardsman killed during peacekeeping operations in Cyprus. The Queen attended his funeral, as was customary for monarchs honoring fallen service members. However, 3 months later, she made an unprecedented decision that would shape royal protocol for the rest of her reign. She quietly visited Davies' widow, Patricia, and their infant son at their modest home in Cardiff. The visit wasn't announced to the media or recorded in official royal schedules. The Queen simply appeared at Patricia Davies' door one Tuesday afternoon, accompanied only by a single protection officer. She spent 2 hours with the grieving widow, drinking tea, holding the baby, and listening to stories about Sergeant Davies' life and dreams. Before leaving, she made Patricia a promise that would define a hidden aspect of royal service for decades to come. "Your husband served me faithfully," the Queen told her. "Now I shall serve his family faithfully. You will not be forgotten." Colonel Robert Sheffield, who served as the Queen's military liaison from 1978 to 2015, witnessed the development of this extraordinary tradition. After her visit to Patricia Davies, the Queen instructed palace staff to maintain detailed records of every service member killed in action during her reign. More importantly, she committed to personally maintaining contact with their families for as long as they wished. This wasn't simple condolence correspondence. The Queen remembered the names, ages, and circumstances of surviving family members. She sent birthday cards to the children of fallen soldiers, Often, for decades, she attended graduations, weddings, and other significant life events when families invited her and her schedule permitted. She provided practical assistance through discretionary royal funds when families faced financial difficulties. Most remarkably, she maintained personal relationships with these families that lasted for generations. Patricia Davies' son, Michael, named for his father, received a birthday card from the Queen every year until her death in 2022. When he graduated from university, married, and had children of his own, the Queen continued to remember his family's milestones. His own children knew the Queen as Granny Lilibet, a family friend who had loved their grandfather before they were born. The scope of this tradition was staggering. Palace records show that Queen Elizabeth II maintained active contact with over 15,000 military families during her reign. Each family received personalized attention based on their specific circumstances and needs. Some wanted regular contact and involvement in their lives, others preferred quiet support from a distance. The Queen adapted her approach to each family's preferences while maintaining her commitment to none being forgotten. Martha Henley, who lost her husband during the Falklands conflict, recalled the Queen's extraordinary memory for personal details. She would ask about my daughter's piano lessons, remember that my son struggled with mathematics, inquire about my mother's arthritis. She knew us as people, not just as the family of a fallen soldier. When my daughter graduated medical school 30 years after her father's death, the Queen was there in the audience, crying tears of pride, just like any grandmother. This tradition required enormous emotional investment from the Queen. She carried the grief of thousands of families, celebrated their joys, and worried about their struggles. Palace staff noted that she often spent sleepless nights during military operations, not just concerned about strategic outcomes but personally anxious about the individual service members whose families she already knew. The tradition also involved significant practical commitments. The Queen maintained a private fund, drawn from her personal resources rather than public money, to assist military families facing hardship. She provided emergency funds for medical expenses, educational costs, housing deposits, and other unexpected needs. Her financial support helped hundreds of military children attend university, assisted widows in purchasing homes, and provided medical care for family members dealing with service-related trauma. King Charles III inherited the responsibility for honoring military families, but the intensely personal nature of his mother's relationships with thousands of individual families made continuing the exact tradition impossible. While he has established his own protocols for supporting military families, the specific bonds forged over 60 years of personal involvement ended with Queen Elizabeth II's death. The fifth tradition that concluded was perhaps the most surprising element of royal life: the Queen's role as an unofficial marriage counselor to ordinary British couples. For 47 years, Queen Elizabeth II offered private marriage guidance to couples facing serious difficulties, a service that remained completely confidential and was known only to a handful of palace staff. This unusual tradition began in 1975, when the Queen encountered a young couple arguing intensely in Windsor Great Park during one of her morning horse rides. The couple, James and Helen Morrison, were so absorbed in their dispute that they didn't initially notice the Queen approaching on horseback. When they finally recognized her, they were mortified and began apologizing profusely for their public argument. Instead of simply accepting their apologies and continuing her ride, the Queen dismounted and asked if she could help. What followed was an honest conversation about the pressures facing young marriages in modern Britain. The Morrisons, both teachers struggling with financial stress and career decisions, found themselves confiding in their monarch about problems they had shared with no one else. The Queen listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and offered practical advice drawn from her own experience, maintaining a marriage in the public eye. She spoke about the importance of communication, the challenge of balancing individual ambitions with shared goals, and the necessity of supporting each other through difficult periods. Most importantly, she emphasized that seeking help was a sign of strength, not weakness. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. By its end, The Morrisons had gained new perspective on their relationship and renewed commitment to working through their difficulties. They thanked the Queen profusely, assuming this had been a chance encounter that would never be repeated. 3 weeks later, they received an invitation to tea at Windsor Castle. The Queen had remembered their situation and wanted to follow up on their progress. This began a pattern that would continue for decades: private counseling sessions with couples facing marital crises, conducted with absolute discretion and genuine care. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a marriage counselor who occasionally consulted with palace staff on this initiative, explained the Queen's approach. Her Majesty brought a unique perspective to marriage counseling. She understood the pressures of public life, the challenges of maintaining relationships across decades, and the importance of duty and commitment. She had lived through her own marital difficulties in the public eye and learned valuable lessons about resilience and forgiveness. The Queen's marriage counseling sessions typically took place during weekend afternoons at Windsor Castle or Balmoral, depending on the season. Couples were brought to the castle quietly, without media attention or official announcement. Sessions lasted 2 to 4 hours and included tea, informal conversation, and focused discussion about specific relationship challenges. What made the Queen's counseling distinctive was her emphasis on practical solutions rather than psychological theory. She helped couples develop communication strategies, set realistic expectations for their relationships, and find ways to support each other through external pressures. She often shared stories from her own marriage, including challenges she and Prince Philip had faced and overcome. Palace records indicate that Queen Elizabeth II counseled over 800 couples during her reign. Her success rate was remarkable. Palace staff tracked outcomes informally and found that roughly 85% of couples who received royal marriage counseling reported significant improvement in their relationships within 6 months of their sessions. The tradition required absolute confidentiality. Couples who participated were asked to sign agreements never to discuss their sessions publicly, and palace staff involved were bound by similar commitments. The Queen insisted that her role as marriage counselor remain completely separate from her public duties as monarch. Some of the couples the Queen counseled became lifelong friends. She attended anniversary celebrations, children's christenings, and other family milestones. She maintained interest in their lives and continued offering support and advice when requested. Many couples credited the Queen with saving their marriages during crucial moments of crisis. The marriage counseling tradition reflected the Queen's deep belief in the importance of strong families as the foundation of stable society. She viewed her role in supporting marriages as part of her broader duty to serve her subjects' well-being. However, the intensely personal nature of this service and the extensive time commitment it required made it impossible for King Charles III to continue in the same form. The sixth tradition that ended was the Queen's practice of maintaining what palace insiders called the Children's Network, a system for staying connected with children across Britain who had written to her about serious problems or difficulties. This tradition began in 1969 and grew into one of the most extensive, private charitable efforts in British history. The tradition started when 8-year-old Timothy Walsh wrote to the Queen about his father's deployment to Northern Ireland during the height of the Troubles. Timothy's letter, written in careful cursive handwriting, expressed his fear that his father might not return home safely. The Queen was moved by the child's honesty and vulnerability, and instead of sending a standard reply, she wrote a personal response acknowledging his fears and offering reassurance. 6 months later, when Timothy's father returned safely from deployment, the Queen remembered to send a congratulatory note celebrating the family reunion. This personal follow-up established a pattern that would continue for over 50 years. Ongoing relationships with children who had reached out to their monarch during difficult times. Lady Catherine Pemberton, who coordinated the Children's Network from 1995 to 2020, described the scope and impact of this tradition. Her Majesty maintained active correspondence with thousands of children across decades. She remembered birthdays, school milestones, family changes, and personal achievements. Children who wrote to her during parental divorces, serious illnesses, family tragedies, or other crises received not just initial responses, but ongoing support and encouragement. The Queen's approach to children was notably different from her formal royal duties. She wrote in simple language that children could easily understand, often including small sketches or drawings in her letters. She shared stories about her own pets, her gardens, and her family in ways that made her seem like a caring grandmother rather than a distant monarch. Children facing particularly serious challenges received special attention. Those dealing with life-threatening illnesses might receive regular letters, small gifts, and occasionally personal visits when the Queen's schedule permitted. Children in foster care or facing family disruptions often became long-term correspondents who maintained contact with the Queen throughout their childhood and into adulthood. The network grew organically as word spread among teachers, social workers, and community leaders about the Queen's genuine interest in helping children. Schools began encouraging students facing difficulties to write to Her Majesty. Children's hospitals provided writing materials for young patients who wanted to share their experiences with the Queen. Foster care agencies suggested that children in their care might benefit from royal correspondence. By 2020, palace records showed that Queen Elizabeth II maintained active correspondence with over 25,000 children and young adults across the United Kingdom. Each relationship was tracked carefully, with detailed records of family circumstances, personal interests, academic progress, and significant life events. The Queen allocated substantial time each week to reading letters from children and crafting personal responses. The most remarkable aspect of this tradition was its longevity. Children who first wrote to the Queen in elementary school continued receiving letters through secondary school, university, marriage, and parenthood. Many second-generation correspondents began writing to the Queen about their own children's achievements and challenges. Emma Thompson began corresponding with the Queen at age 7, after writing about her mother's battle with cancer. 38 years later, she was still receiving letters from Her Majesty, now about Emma's own children and their accomplishments. The Queen watched me grow up through letters, Emma reflected. She celebrated my graduation, my wedding, my children's births. She was a constant, encouraging presence throughout my entire life. The Children's Network required significant resources beyond the Queen's personal time. Palace staff managed complex logistics for sending gifts, coordinating special visits, and maintaining detailed records of thousands of individual relationships. The Queen allocated portions of her private funds to provide assistance when children's families faced financial hardships affecting education, medical care, or basic needs. King Charles III inherited responsibility for royal correspondence with young people. But the scale and personal nature of his mother's children's network made continuing it in the same form impossible. While he has established his own methods for connecting with young subjects, the specific relationships built over decades of individual attention ended with Queen Elizabeth II's death. These 6 traditions, guardianship of military families, private marriage counseling, and the Children's Network, along with the 3 previously described, represented a unique approach to monarchy based on personal service to individual subjects. They required enormous investments of time, emotion, and resources that Queen Elizabeth II gladly provided because she believed her role demanded genuine care for her people's well-being. Their conclusion marks the end of a distinctive vision of royal service that emphasized personal relationships over institutional protocols, individual attention over public ceremonies, and private kindness over public recognition. While future monarchs will develop their own approaches to serving their subjects, these particular traditions remain permanently associated with Queen Elizabeth II's extraordinary reign and her remarkable commitment to personal connection with the people she served. The 7th tradition, that ended with Queen Elizabeth II, was perhaps the most extraordinary and least known of all her personal customs. For 39 years, the Queen maintained what palace staff discreetly called the midnight rounds, a practice of personally visiting hospitals across Britain during overnight hours to comfort patients and families during medical crises. This remarkable tradition began in 1983 following a chance encounter that would shape the Queen's understanding of her role during her subjects' most vulnerable moments. While returning late one evening from a state dinner in London, the Queen's convoy was diverted due to an emergency vehicle blocking the main route. The detour took them past St. Mary's Hospital, where the Queen noticed unusual activity in the emergency department, despite the late hour. Curious about the situation and moved by an impulse she would later describe as providential, the Queen asked her driver to stop. Against all protocol, and to the horror of her security detail, she entered the hospital to inquire about the emergency. What she discovered changed her perspective on royal service forever. The hospital was dealing with a major traffic accident involving a school bus returning from a theater trip. Dozens of children and teenagers were being treated for injuries ranging from minor cuts to life-threatening trauma. Parents were arriving throughout the night, many in states of panic and desperation, as they searched for information about their children's conditions. Dr. Michael Harrison, the emergency department chief that night, recalled his amazement when Queen Elizabeth II appeared in his trauma unit at 2:30 a.m. She simply walked in and asked how she could help. No announcement, no protocol, no ceremony. She saw people suffering and wanted to provide comfort. The Queen spent 4 hours at the hospital that night. She sat with parents waiting for news about their children's surgeries, held the hands of conscious patients who were frightened and in pain, and offered quiet words of encouragement to medical staff working under enormous pressure. She didn't ask for recognition or publicity. In fact, she specifically requested that her presence not be reported to the media. The experience profoundly affected her understanding of when royal presence could matter most. She realized that ceremonial visits to hospitals during daylight hours, surrounded by officials and media, served important institutional functions, but missed opportunities to provide genuine comfort when people needed it most desperately. Within weeks, the Queen had established a discreet system for identifying medical crises where her presence might provide comfort to patients and families. A small team of palace staff maintained contact with major hospitals across Britain, not to interfere with medical care but to be aware of situations where royal support might make a difference to people facing their darkest hours. The midnight rounds followed no fixed schedule. The Queen might visit a hospital in Manchester, where a child was fighting for life after a serious accident. Comfort families in Edinburgh, dealing with an unexpected medical emergency, or provide support to medical staff in Birmingham during particularly challenging periods. These visits were always unannounced, always private, and always focused entirely on the people she was there to help. Sister Catherine Walsh, who worked night shifts at several London hospitals during the 1992nd, described the Queen's approach during these visits. She understood that people experiencing medical crises weren't concerned with royal protocol or formal behavior. She would sit beside hospital beds, sometimes for hours, just being present with families during the worst moments of their lives. She had an extraordinary ability to provide comfort simply through her presence and genuine concern. The Queen's medical visits weren't limited to emergencies. She also made regular overnight visits to hospices, children's hospitals, and facilities caring for patients with terminal illnesses. These visits were often the most emotionally challenging for her personally, but she considered them among the most important aspects of her service as monarch. At Great Ormond Street Hospital, the Queen maintained relationships with dozens of families whose children were receiving long-term treatment for serious conditions. She would arrive quietly during evening hours when families were exhausted from daily hospital routines, bringing small gifts, sharing stories, and providing the kind of personal attention that busy medical staff, despite their dedication, simply couldn't offer. The midnight rounds tradition required enormous personal sacrifice from the Queen. These visits were emotionally draining and physically exhausting, often requiring her to be present during intensely painful moments in families' lives. She witnessed countless deaths, comforted bereaved parents, and supported families facing devastating medical diagnoses. Palace staff who accompanied the Queen on these visits noted her remarkable ability to provide appropriate comfort, regardless of the situation. She seemed to intuitively understand when to speak and when to simply be present, when to offer practical help and when to provide spiritual support, when to stay for hours and when a brief visit would be more appropriate. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, who coordinated palliative care at several hospitals where the Queen made regular visits, observed the profound impact of these royal appearances. Families facing terminal diagnoses or traumatic injuries often felt completely alone and overwhelmed by medical systems they didn't understand. The Queen's presence somehow made their experiences feel acknowledged and important. She had a gift for making people feel that their suffering mattered to someone in a position of great authority and influence. The tradition also had significant impact on medical staff. Nurses, doctors, and support workers who witnessed the Queen's dedication to comforting patients developed deeper appreciation for the service aspects of their own roles. Many reported that her example inspired them to approach their work with greater compassion and attention to the emotional needs of patients and families. The eighth tradition that concluded with the Queen's death was her role as what palace insiders called the National Confessor. A unique position that developed over decades as British citizens increasingly turned to their monarch for moral guidance during personal ethical dilemmas. This tradition emerged gradually during the 1970s and 1980s, as social changes in Britain created new moral complexities that traditional religious and community leaders seemed unable to address effectively. People facing difficult ethical decisions began writing to the Queen, not seeking official royal pronouncements but requesting personal guidance from someone they trusted to have wisdom and moral clarity. The letters covered an extraordinary range of moral dilemmas. Parents struggling with decisions about children with severe disabilities sought the Queen's guidance about quality of life questions. Business leaders facing ethical challenges in their companies requested advice about balancing profit with moral responsibility. Individuals discovering their spouse's infidelity asked for wisdom about forgiveness versus divorce. Young people considering military service during controversial conflicts sought guidance about duty versus conscience. What made the Queen's role as National Confessor unique was her approach to moral guidance. Rather than providing definitive answers to ethical questions, she helped people think through their dilemmas more clearly by asking thoughtful questions and sharing relevant experiences from her own life and observations. Canon Dr. Robert Thomson, who occasionally consulted with the Queen about religious and ethical matters, explained her philosophy regarding moral guidance. Her Majesty understood that most ethical dilemmas don't have simple right or wrong answers. She helped people examine their situations from multiple perspectives, consider the consequences of different choices, and ultimately, make decisions they could live with based on their own values and circumstances. The Queen's moral guidance letters were always highly personal and never formulaic. She addressed each person's specific situation with careful attention to their unique circumstances, relationships, and constraints. Her responses demonstrated deep understanding of human nature and genuine empathy for the difficulties people faced in navigating complex moral terrain. One of the most challenging aspects of this tradition involved helping people deal with family conflicts that had moral dimensions. The Queen regularly received letters from adult children struggling with decisions about caring for aging parents, parents facing difficulties with troubled teenagers, and spouses dealing with partners suffering from dementia or other conditions that fundamentally changed their personalities and relationships. Margaret Stevens, who corresponded with the Queen for 15 years about various family ethical dilemmas, described the value of royal moral guidance. Her Majesty never told me what to do, but she helped me understand the different aspects of difficult situations I was facing. She had lived through so many changes in society and witnessed so many human dramas that her perspective was invaluable. She helped me see that most ethical problems don't have perfect solutions. They just have choices that we can live with more easily than others. The tradition of providing personal moral guidance required enormous emotional investment from the Queen. She carried the weight of thousands of people's ethical struggles and often spent considerable time crafting responses that might help individuals navigate their moral dilemmas more effectively. Palace staff noted that she frequently consulted religious leaders, philosophers, and ethicists to ensure her guidance reflected careful consideration of different moral frameworks and perspectives. The ninth and perhaps most surprising tradition that ended was the Queen's practice of maintaining what she called the People's Garden at Buckingham Palace, a section of the royal gardens dedicated specifically to growing food that was distributed to families facing food insecurity across London. This tradition began in 1979, during a period of economic recession, when the Queen became aware that many British families, including those with employed heads of household, were struggling to afford adequate nutrition. Rather than simply making financial donations to food charities, she decided to create a practical demonstration of royal commitment to addressing hunger. The Queen personally selected a 2-acre section of Buckingham Palace gardens to be converted into productive vegetable plots. Working with the royal gardeners, she planned crops that would provide maximum nutritional value and could be distributed effectively to families in need. The garden produced potatoes, carrots, onions, cabbage, beans, and other staple vegetables that formed the foundation of healthy family meals. What made this tradition remarkable was the Queen's personal involvement in the garden work. Despite having no formal agricultural training, she spent several hours each week working in the vegetable plots, learning about soil preparation, planting schedules, pest management, and harvesting techniques. Palace staff initially worried about the appropriateness of their monarch engaging in manual agricultural labor, but the Queen insisted that meaningful service required personal involvement, not just symbolic gestures. Head gardener Thomas Mitchell, who managed the People's Garden from 1985 to 2018, recalled the Queen's dedication to learning practical farming skills. Her Majesty approached gardening with the same methodical attention she brought to all her royal duties. She kept detailed records of planting dates, weather conditions, crop yields, and distribution schedules. She wanted to understand every aspect of food production so she could speak knowledgeably about agricultural challenges facing British farmers. The garden's produce was distributed through a network of local churches, community centers, and social services organizations across London. The Queen insisted that recipients never be told the source of the vegetables. She wanted people to receive nutrition without feeling they were accepting charity from their monarch. Distribution was handled discreetly through existing food assistance programs. Over 4 decades, the People's Garden produced over 500,000 pounds of fresh vegetables that were distributed to families facing food insecurity. The Queen tracked the garden's impact through reports from partner organizations and was particularly pleased when social workers reported that children who had received royal vegetables were showing improved health and school performance. The tradition expanded beyond simple food production to include educational components. The Queen occasionally hosted small groups of school children from disadvantaged neighborhoods for garden tours, where she taught them about growing their own food. These educational sessions were designed to help children understand where food comes from and develop skills they could use to improve their own family's nutrition. The People's Garden also served as a research site for sustainable agricultural practices. The Queen worked with agricultural experts to test organic farming methods, water conservation techniques, and crop varieties that might be particularly suitable for British climate conditions. Information learned from these experiments was shared with farmers and community gardening groups across the country. The 10th tradition that concluded with Queen Elizabeth II was perhaps the most personal and touching of all. Her practice of maintaining lifelong friendships with individuals from all walks of life who had touched her heart during chance encounters throughout her reign. This tradition had no formal structure or official recognition. It simply reflected the Queen's natural tendency to remember people who had impressed her with their kindness, courage, wisdom, or humor during brief meetings that might otherwise have been forgotten. Over 7 decades, these chance encounters grew into a network of hundreds of personal friendships that enriched the Queen's life and provided her with insights into the experiences of ordinary British citizens. The tradition began early in her reign, when a young factory worker named David Wilson helped the Queen change a tire during an unscheduled stop in Coventry in 1954. Wilson's cheerful competence and respectful humor during the unexpected encounter impressed the Queen, who made note of his name and workplace. 6 months later, Wilson received an invitation to a garden party at Buckingham Palace, beginning a friendship that lasted until the Queen's death 68 years later. Wilson's relationship with the Queen exemplified the nature of these lifelong friendships. They exchanged Christmas cards annually, with the Queen often including personal notes about significant events in Wilson's life: his marriage, the births of his children, his work achievements, and eventually his retirement. When Wilson faced serious health challenges in his 70s, The Queen arranged for him to receive specialized medical care and financial assistance to ensure his family wouldn't face hardship during his illness. Lady Margaret Thornbury, who served as the Queen's private secretary from 2005 to 2018, managed the logistics of maintaining these personal friendships. Her Majesty had an extraordinary memory for people who had made positive impressions on her during royal visits, chance encounters, or brief conversations. She would ask staff to follow up with individuals who had shown particular kindness, intelligence, or character, often developing relationships that lasted for decades. These friendships crossed all social and economic boundaries. The Queen maintained personal relationships with farmers, teachers, shop clerks, taxi drivers, nurses, mechanics, artists, and countless other individuals whose paths had crossed hers during her royal duties. She remembered their personal circumstances, celebrated their achievements, and provided support during difficult periods. One of the most enduring friendships began in 1967, when the Queen met Eleanor Campbell, a widowed mother of 4 who was working 3 jobs to support her family after her husband's death in a mining accident. The Queen encountered Campbell during a visit to a Welsh mining community and was impressed by her determination and optimism despite facing overwhelming challenges. The Queen quietly provided financial assistance to help Campbell's children attend university, maintained regular correspondence about the family's progress, and eventually attended all 4 children's weddings as an honored guest. Campbell's descendants considered the Queen an honorary grandmother, and several generations of the family maintained close relationships with Her Majesty throughout her life. The personal friendships tradition required significant emotional investment and practical resources from the Queen. She allocated time each week to writing personal letters to friends, remembering birthdays and anniversaries, and arranging assistance when friends faced difficulties. Her private funds supported education, medical care, housing, and other needs for friends who couldn't afford necessary services. These friendships provided the Queen with invaluable insights into the real experiences of her subjects. Unlike the formal briefings and official reports that informed her understanding of national issues, her personal friends shared honest perspectives about the challenges and opportunities facing ordinary British families. Their stories influenced her understanding of social problems and shaped her approach to royal service. The 11th tradition that ended was the Queen's practice of what palace staff called the wisdom circles. Regular informal gatherings where she met with elderly British citizens to learn from their life experiences and share stories about historical events they had witnessed together. This tradition began in 1977 during the Queen's Silver Jubilee year, when she realized that she shared living memory of significant historical events with thousands of her older subjects. She began organizing small, private gatherings with groups of elderly citizens to discuss their shared memories of events like World War II, the social changes of the 1,960 seconds, economic challenges of the 1,970 seconds, and other significant developments they had all experienced. The wisdom circles typically included 8 to 12 participants, usually ranging in age from their 70s to over 100. Participants were selected not for their prominence or achievements, but for their interesting life experiences and ability to share stories effectively. The Queen particularly enjoyed hearing from people who had witnessed the same events from different perspectives: workers and managers from the same factory, neighbors from different social classes, or individuals who had experienced the same historical moment in different parts of the United Kingdom. Dr. Patricia Morris, a social historian who occasionally facilitated these gatherings, described their unique value. These sessions provided the Queen with insights into how ordinary people had experienced the major events of her reign. She learned how government policies had affected real families, how social changes had impacted different communities, and how people had adapted to challenges that official reports could never fully capture. The wisdom circles revealed aspects of British history that formal documentation often missed. Participants shared stories about community solidarity during wartime, creative solutions people developed during economic hardships, and personal strategies for maintaining hope during difficult periods. The Queen often said these conversations taught her more about the real impact of historical events than any official briefing or academic analysis. The 12th and final tradition that concluded with Queen Elizabeth II was perhaps the most fitting conclusion to a reign defined by personal service. Her practice of writing thank you letters to everyone who had served her during her 70-year reign, from the most senior officials to the most junior staff members. This tradition began in 2020, when the Queen, perhaps sensing that her time was limited, started systematically writing personal thank you notes to individuals who had contributed to her ability to serve as monarch. The letters weren't formal acknowledgments of service, but personal reflections on how each individual's contributions had enriched her life and enabled her to fulfill her duties effectively. The scope of this final tradition was extraordinary. Palace records indicate that Queen Elizabeth II wrote over 8,000 personal thank you letters during her final 2 years, addressing everyone from former prime ministers to the cleaning staff who had maintained her residences, from her closest advisors to the gardeners who had tended her beloved flowers. Each letter was unique and personal, reflecting specific memories the Queen had of working with each individual. She recalled particular moments of competence, kindness, or dedication that had impressed her, often referencing events that had occurred decades earlier. The letters demonstrated her remarkable memory for people and her genuine appreciation for the countless individuals who had supported her service as monarch. Thomas Henderson, who served as a palace footman from 1985 to 2010, received his thank you letter in early 2022. Her Majesty remembered specific occasions when I had helped her with difficult situations, including a state dinner where everything went wrong with the kitchen equipment. She thanked me not just for doing my job, but for keeping my sense of humor and helping her maintain her composure during a very stressful evening. I was amazed that she remembered such details from something that happened nearly 20 years ago. The thank you letter tradition represented a final demonstration of the personal approach to monarchy that had defined Queen Elizabeth II's entire reign. Rather than ending her service with formal ceremonies or institutional recognition, she chose to conclude with personal acknowledgement of the thousands of individuals who had made her extraordinary service possible. These 12 traditions, from handwritten correspondence to final thank you letters, represented a unique approach to monarchy based on personal connection, individual service, and genuine care for the well-being of subjects. They required enormous investments of time, emotion, and resources that Queen Elizabeth II gladly provided, because she understood her role as fundamentally about serving people rather than simply representing institutions. Their conclusion marks the end of a distinctive era in British monarchy, one defined by personal relationships rather than institutional protocols, individual attention rather than ceremonial appearances, and private kindness rather than public recognition. While future monarchs will develop their own approaches to royal service, these particular traditions remain permanently associated with Queen Elizabeth II's remarkable reign and her extraordinary commitment to personal connection with the people she served for 70 years. The legacy of these traditions extends beyond their historical significance. They demonstrated that meaningful leadership requires personal investment in the lives of those being led, that genuine service demands individual attention rather than institutional gestures, and that lasting impact comes from consistent, personal acts of kindness rather than grand public ceremonies. As Britain moves forward under King Charles III, the memory of these ended traditions serves as a reminder of what made Queen Elizabeth II's reign truly extraordinary. Not her longevity or ceremonial role, but her deep, personal commitment to serving her subjects as individuals, rather than simply as a collective population. Her approach to monarchy created connections between sovereign and subject that enriched both her own life and the lives of countless British citizens who experienced royal attention during their most significant moments of need, celebration, and everyday life. The traditions that ended with Queen Elizabeth II represented more than just royal customs. They embodied a philosophy of service that prioritized people over protocols, relationships over ceremonies, and personal attention over institutional efficiency. Their disappearance marks not just the end of specific practices but the conclusion of a particular vision of what it means to serve others in positions of authority and privilege.